Tomorrow is, of course, St. Patrick's Day, and while it's a wonderfully popular celebration, especially for those of Irish descent, I'm saddened that it has become a bit of a caricature of what the day is meant to be. It is, of course, the feast day of a saint, a real man who lived in the 4th century, a man of indomitable faith, actually not Irish, but British, who was sold into slavery in Ireland as a young boy, and then escaped and then returned again there as a missionary and brought the Catholic faith to that pagan island. In Britain, after his escape as a young man, St. Patrick underwent a great conversion. The change in him would indeed result in a change in the history of Ireland and indeed of the world. And of course, as we mentioned last week, this reality and this call to change is the essence of our call of Lent. Our readings today speak of this total transformation that is meant for each of us in and by the power of God's grace. St. Paul, who's writing in our second reading, of course, knows of such a dramatic change as he was blinded on the road to Damascus. And so he writes of all that need to experience this change. But yet he recognizes a truth about the human person, then, now, and always, that change is difficult for us, even when the change that is proposed is the total freedom and joy in Christ. Many will still refuse that offer. He mentions this group, those who have ignored the call of Christ, who are disinterested in him, who are occupied with earthly things, whose God is their stomach. Unfortunately, this can describe us sometimes. We hear the call of Lent, which is this call to change, this call to prayer, to fasting, and almsgiving. And we know the change in our interior dispositions that these practices are meant to produce. And yet we can so easily forget or ignore that call. In our first reading, we hear about Abraham. He's still known as Abram. In the chapters preceding the one that we heard from, we've learned that he is 75 years old. He is thought to be sterile. He is set in his ways, so to speak. But the Lord calls him to a dramatic change, to leave his home and to travel to a destination that has been selected for him. And so he goes. He's able to do that because he's not consumed with a kind of self-centered motivation, but solely with following the Lord. And so he is changed, transformed. He now becomes Abraham, not as he was thought to be old and sterile, but the one who will become the father of countless generations. And so all of these changes, the changes to which we are called, see their ultimate end in this change that we see in our gospel. This gospel that we hear every year on this second Sunday of Lent from one of the various synoptic writers, the event of the Transfiguration. Jesus takes James, Peter, and John up the mountain. He undergoes an indescribable change. He's transformed from his normal appearance to a brightness and a brilliance that is from another world. Of course, Christ does not change in any essential way because he is the unchanging Son of God. But his outward appearance does change to serve as a revelation for Peter and James and John and for all of us, to strengthen us to follow him so that you and I might then be changed. There is a basic theological principle that states grace builds on nature. It's a teaching of the truth of our faith that God first creates each of us with our natural dispositions and talents, and that his grace will then not operate in opposition to or against those natural gifts that he has given to us. So God's grace is not meant to change us into something or someone different. But His grace is meant to reveal in each of us who we are and who by His grace we are meant to be, His beloved son or daughter. In our baptism, we have been united to Him, and in this Holy Eucharist, this communion with Him is strengthened and perfected. And then again in our Lenten practices of prayer and fasting and almsgiving, His grace and life will then change us, or maybe a better term is reveal in us our true self that is sadly obscured and disfigured by sin. St. Patrick heard this call of Christ and everything changed. So did Abraham and Paul and countless others in the history of the church. And so it is to be for us. May we be open to that change that He wishes to effect in us. May we recommit ourselves again throughout this season of Lent to prayer and to fasting and almsgiving. And let us do so not with the empty confidence that can sometimes come from self, but with the confidence of faith that assures us that every good thing that we do is accomplished by the power of God, following St. Paul's advice to stand firm in the Lord so as to be changed, transformed by the power of His strength and His grace.